Hello again. Today I thought I'd do another one of these talks on aspects of the Roman army, and in this case the broad theme is running the Roman army. How did it all work? So we're going to be looking really at bureaucracy, administration, paperwork, things that don't perhaps sound as exciting and dramatic as tactics and battles, but they are important for understanding how the army functioned and how the Roman Empire functioned, how its frontiers worked and all this sort of thing. Now, obviously, we're going to be looking today at different types of evidence, most of it that's been acquired archaeologically, of these texts that tell us about the mundane things that went on in the Roman army. And the broader question is just how much did the Roman authorities, the army commanders, the Roman emperor himself actually know about the soldiers they were paying and they were stationing in various parts of the empire? Now, we'll talk more generally about the role of bureaucracy and its importance and all the flaws that we'll see in the modern world later on in the conclusion. But it's worth starting with, there's always been this traditional assumption, and it's the impression that many of us get when we start to look at the Roman Empire and the Roman world, and that's just how modern the Romans seem to be. You know, they are very sophisticated. The engineering of bathhouses, of roads, of this very strong concrete, all these things they could build, and the sheer organisation. The wonder of the story of Rome is how does this one city come to dominate such a large part of the known world and dominate it for so long and make people Roman? So at first sight, the Romans are very modern, and they have some of the vices of modern society. Luxury, they've got more money than they know what to do with, they can waste vast resources on entertainment, and they do it in a particularly unpleasant way with gladiators and this sort of thing, and beast fights and all this sort of stuff. In the latter part of the 20th century in particular, there was a strong reaction with many scholars against this sense of the modern Romans, that the Romans were just like us and just like a modern society and modern government. And this would be tied up with all the debates over how the empire worked, how the frontiers worked, grand strategy, defense of the Roman Empire, or were they not really thinking about that? Was it all about prestige? Now, in talks to come, we'll look in some detail at the whole debate over grand strategy and how the frontiers and the empire worked militarily. But it's useful before we get to that to look at aspects like this because it does raise so many questions. Various sides of the debate will tell you that the Romans either know a lot about what's going on, they know a lot about the geography, topography of a region, and others will deny that they have much clue about any of this. And there was a tendency to emphasize almost to excess how primitive, how different the Romans were. Part of this was the emphasis on society and say, well, things that seem natural to us as a way of solving a problem or way of acting might not necessarily have seemed natural to a 1st or 2nd century AD Roman. In the same way that things that seem natural to us as the products of Western society in the late 20th, 21st century might not necessarily seem so natural to people from other parts of the world even today. So it's that whole cultural thing of just how the environment, the way people are raised, their assumptions about the world, about religion, about how things are done, how society acts, the obligations of one person to another, influence the way they go about doing things. And those are all related to the economy and the sort of society and this sort of thing. So there are big questions behind this, even though today we'll mostly look at what evidence there is and give a taste of that and a sense of, again, comes back to this, what does the emperor know? How much did the Roman army really know about what its soldiers were doing, what they were up to, where they were, and how much control was there? Because obviously that's fundamental to when you look at questions of strategy and grand strategy, is the degree to which you can actually get the armed forces you possess to do what you want, when you want, and the degree to which you can plan ahead, because that is particularly relevant to these questions of strategy and central planning, really, of the empire. So we can look at all of these things, and my stance in this has been, while it's been very useful to raise these questions and emphasize how different the Romans could be in many respects, the Roman army poses a problem for many scholars who adopt that approach and particularly push it to an extreme, because actually the Roman army is the best documented and most organized, the most bureaucratic part of the Roman state. We have more evidence for this than anything else. And the Roman army does have 300,000 plus men, in theory, scattered around the empire, and is able to know where they are, get them fed, get them paid, move them to different provinces, and manage all of that in an organized way. Now, military record keeping is one of the earliest forms of record keeping, and you'll see it popping up with cuneiform tablets, Linear B with the Mycenaeans. Some of those deal with the stationing of troops along coastline of part of Greece, for instance. Trade, basically, and armed force tend to be the big things that you want records about. So trade, property, goods, and their exchange, and produce of farmland and where it goes. Those are things you track. And later on you can add things like laws, but they're not necessarily written down for some time. Use of armed forces, again, requires effort. There is a practical element that's one of the problems, that when there were many scholars inclined to see aspects of Roman society and the way the Roman Empire worked as largely symbolic, and you might have these big archives and military base, but it's more to show off how organized you are rather than actually be organized. Unfortunately, there are an awful lot of academics who have no experience of the wider world, so have never had to organize anything, have never had to ensure that the several hundred men of this cohort get to this place, they are fed, they've got boots, they've got equipment, and they know what they're supposed to be doing. But the army does throw up lots of problems, which is why many scholars who are inclined that way and who tend to emphasize this ignore the Roman army as far as they can. Others will just dismiss it either as an anomaly or say, well, again, it comes back to this idea. No. There's all this documentation, there's all these letters, but it's largely symbolic. The purpose of this talk will be, A, to explain what evidence we have, the picture it paints, but also to criticize that view, because it simply doesn't work when you look at the evidence. So let's actually get to some proper evidence on what the Roman army's up to. And we're going to start with what we call an ostraca, or ostracon in singular. And these are pieces of pottery. Now you can see a picture of this one, which was found in Egypt. And the top part, the neck, which is partly broken, there are several texts on it. This contains a report by the commander of a small Roman garrison, and it's with comments to be circulated to outposts along the Myos-Hormos road. This is one of the roads that leads from the proper province of Roman Egypt through the desert down to the Red Sea ports, where trade is conducted to Sri Lanka, to India and beyond, and all around the Gulf. And it's sent to prefects, centurions, decurions, duplicaries, esquiplicari, and post commanders. Presumably don't have any formal rank. And it's written by an eques from a cohors equitata. So again, this is an official document, an official report. It's basically instructions. It's a warning to other Roman garrisons. But it's actually written. It's a copy of it written on this piece of pottery and written on part of it. Now these... Papyrus is something that we'll look at more as we go on, and obviously that's famous. It's the sort of the type of paper that is most common, and obviously particularly in Egypt, where you can grow the stuff and produce it. It is, however, expensive. So wooden writing tablets are cheaper, particularly in the northern parts of the empire, and ostraca, these broken pieces of pottery, because pottery, yes, it breaks and shatters into pieces, but then it doesn't degrade on its own. So it's a very handy, not so much for your smart copies, the official letter, the official orders, but for the duplicates, basically the equivalent of putting carbon paper in the way they used to do, or banging off a few quick copies that you need just for your immediate use, perhaps for records, but eventually these turn up because they've been dumped somewhere. Because obviously they're bulky, they're not things you transport around. So this is a very bulky, rather awkward way of record keeping, but it's like jotting something down on any bit of notepaper you happen to have around the house just at that moment, or on the back of a carton from cardboard from some goods or something like that you've bought, or a bit of paper that's a wrapper or anything like that, or a bus ticket, any of these things where there's space to just note something down. That's what this is about. So as I say, these look a little bit odd. So we don't have the complete text of this because, as I say, it's partly broken out, but we can get the gist of what's going on. It's written by this chap called Antonius Celer, and he's a cavalryman, an eques, from the century of Proculus in cohors 2 iterorum equitata. So if you think back, or if you go and look at the video on organisation of the Roman army, it's one of these auxiliary infantry units that has a cavalry component built in. So basically the ratio is normally supposed to be about 4 infantrymen to 1 cavalryman, and these are really the working units of the Roman army because they're so convenient. They're a mini army in themselves, in that they can deal with small problems. They've got a mix of cavalry and infantry, but they're marvellous for patrolling, for garrisoning, for escort duty, all of this sort of thing. But remember, this chap's just an eques, so he is the equivalent of a private in the army, or a trooper, I suppose, if you're following the modern parlance with cavalry. He is not someone of formal military rank, and he is, however, the curator, the commander of this little outpost, and he writes to Cassius Victor, centurion in the same auxiliary unit, and describes an attack by some 60 barbarians on the outpost way station at Patcua. We don't know where that is, but it's one of a series of these very small outposts. They're square-shaped, as are most of the forts once you sort of cross this diagonal line splitting the empire in two. In Britain, Germany, on the Danube, all this sort of thing, in Spain, in North Africa to the west, everything is playing card shaped. The Roman army built up until late 3rd and into the 4th century. Once you cross this line, everything is square, in the way that it's always been for many centuries before the Romans arrived there. We don't quite know, other than habit and practicality. You know, this has these little forts give very much sort of beau geste feel. They're little outposts with a square with rooms built onto the back of the wall around. They're nearly always associated with water. They're by or on a well and a source, which is, again, the logical place. That's where people will want to stop if they're going along these roads, but it's also the bit you want to keep secure. So Celer is an ordinary cavalryman. There were civilian travellers sheltering in and around the fort were involved in the attack, probably the main target of the attackers. Woman and 2 children are abducted. One of the latter, or another child, again, text isn't quite sure, is later found dead. Attack began at the 10th hour of the day, went on until the 2nd hour of the night, and again around dawn the next day. Hermogenes, an infantryman of the century of Serenus, was killed. At least 2 other soldiers were wounded, including Damaenis, cavalryman from the century of Victor, and Valerius Firmus, possibly we haven't got the rest of his name as his horse, of the century of Proculus. Report was sent along the road to the main garrison at the port of Myos Homos. So that's where the big concentration of Roman troops is. You know, all these little outposts have only got a few men in them. The impression is this cavalryman, again, doesn't have full ranks, maybe commanding 10, a dozen or so men. These are very small outposts. So you can't get too much help in terms of lots of people from the next one along the road, that way or the other way. The big concentration, the big force that can come out, the column that can go and chase these bandits, is going to come from the bigger garrison. So, and then it's circulated to the outposts commanded by prefects, centurions, decurions, duplicari, sesquiplicari, and post commanders who, presumably like Celer himself, don't actually have a formal rank. So the praesidium is the place, the station, and it means garrison, and it's often used for forts and Roman bases of any size. And there is clear variation. The curator praesidii is the commander, the curator of the garrison, the sort of, caretaker, the man in charge, effectively. But various ranks: centurions, decurions, principales. These are people like the optio. The curator is a formal rank in the cavalry terma. It's the equivalent of the optio, the 2IC, second in command of the decurion in that case, as opposed to the centurion. The signifer, the standard bearer, the tesserarius, other people, and then the duplicari, double pay men, sesquiplicari, 1.5 pay men, perhaps to ordinary soldiers. Report to be passed on again to these prefects, centurions, decurions, duplicari, and curatores on the Myos Homos route. So that implication that you've got these men of different rank, different status at various places along the way suggests that the sizes of garrison varies, the size of the base varies, and there might be some a bit nearer that have 50 men in as opposed to 10, and therefore you can expect a bit more help from that. Notice, if we go back to the original, that several of the men that are under Celer's command are from different centuries. So this is not the case. We've talked about this a little bit before. There's Very little evidence at all for, say, sending a contubernium, your tent group of 8, off to do a certain job, like a modern squad or section. Though again, modern armies are often quite messy. They will take so many men from a company, from a platoon, from a battalion, and put them together, give them a temporary command, a temporary purpose. You go off, man this outpost, or deal with this particular problem, do this work party, whatever it might be. So again, this is not a formal subunit. This is one created for the purpose of garrisoning this little base. We don't know. I'll do another talk on how these outposts worked and how long maybe people were there. You don't know how long they were actually stationed there. So, is this something you do a tour for a week or two, for a month? Who knows? Depends on the situation, depends on available manpower and Roman sense of whether it was good to have people there a long time, or whether it was inclined to make them stagnate as troops. They're not going to train properly. You can't be sure what they're actually doing from day to day. There's another record from these same garrisons of one of these little outposts hiring a prostitute. And the contract is formally done with the brothel owner, basically, so that this is how much you're going to have to pay. This is the sort of the deposit, basically, and he needs to be looked after and brought back safely, and who will deliver her. And then, this is how much you get, and more than that you've got to pay for. So all this sort of thing is very routine, but that's the sort of stuff we can deal with on other days, because this type of evidence, this low-level stuff, brings you into all sorts of mundane but fascinating aspects of how the Roman world and how the Roman army worked. Now, if we look at another site from Roman Egypt, in this case Mons Claudianus, that's this very large quarry area under military supervision and probably military control, though civilians worked there as well. They include many references to these praesidia, these little garrisons, just like the one from the attack that's been described so far. So, for instance, a centurion at Mons Claudianus writes to the curatores of the praesidia, so that's the garrison commanders plural, these little outposts, asking they assist 2 soldiers engaged in a pursuit. So again, small stale stuff, rather a Wild West field about all this, and this is part of the material that I drew upon when I was doing the Vindlander stories and elsewhere, to give a sense of this frontier life. There's another one where the curator of a praesidium at Rima writes asking for 2 pieces of rope. Again, these places are right out in the desert. There's no market. You can't go and buy anything, so anything they want they have to indent for and apply for. The praesidia are often associated with or equivalent to a water source. Again, as we mentioned this before, it's the logical thing to do. Those are the key places. So they're at good stopping points along the road, but one of the main reasons for that is that you're going to stop where you want, where you can get water. That's the vital thing, because this is very, very harsh terrain, and essentially you have these routes going through, and the little outposts are dotted along them. There aren't settlements that we can see. Anybody who's living there is passing through. This is an area where nomads operate, like the barbarians, as they're termed by the Romans, that have attacked the outposts at Patcua, but they're not stopping there, because just as today, it's not somewhere you want to stop. So you also get, this is from a different site, sometimes you get these more formal military instructions, requests, help these men. I've got 2 men chasing along here, going after a fugitive, then assist them. They're on official duty. I need rope because I don't have any, please supply. You also get the personal documents as well. So it's a reflection, as with papyri, as with writing tablets, it's a mix of the formal documents, but other things generated in day-to-day life by men within the military community. So here we've got this one, Julius Apollinaris of the Terma of Aponius to Julius the Curator. So again, writing to the commander of one of these little outposts, doesn't give his rank beyond that. He's a curator, but presumably that implies if he was a centurion, you'd actually say so. So he might be somebody at relatively low level. Anyway, greeting. Please give Isidorus copper money, since I promised you whatever you send me from your own means. I borrowed from the village and I wish to repay. Farewell, your excellency. So again, Julius Apollinaris, he's a man of no rank. He's an ordinary eques, and he's writing to somebody else who might not be that much senior, but nevertheless, he wants a favour, he wants some money paid over, go shorty for this debt, basically, and I'll pay you back. So they're doing ordinary things, and that's from away from the Red Sea, so hence the presence of the village. And elsewhere, again, this is something we can look at another day. there is a good deal of interaction between the Roman troops and the civilian population in Egypt, probably elsewhere as well, but it's better attested in Egypt. So here's another one. This is Aponius Didymianus Decurion to Julianus the Curator. Greeting. Please send me quickly Atrides, cavalryman of the Terma of Antonius, when you receive the ostracon from me, since the prefect has sent for him. Farewell. So this is instructions. There's a man in your outpost, send him to me because the prefect wants him. Prefect probably of the cohort. You of course have a prefect in charge of the garrison of Egypt, so that's possible, but you'd expect it's the unit commander. And notice again he's referred to as the Terma of Antonius, so we know man's name and this is unit he's from. That reduces it to most 30 odd people, so the odds of two men of the same name being in the same Terma is fairly slim. So it's identifying clearly and saying, I know this man is with you, so you've already got the record that tells you this is where he is, and I want him now because the prefect wants him, so send this man through. So the clear implication of this is that all of this is very natural. This isn't an exceptional thing. Oh, you know, suddenly the prefect's asked, do you know where this man is? And instead, this is a very simple, efficient, modern, in a sense, way of doing things. This soldier is at your outpost. Again, probably he's not with his whole unit, he's just this individual, because they're all individual detached from their parent unit to do service in these various little outposts, and the prefect wants him, so send him to me. Simple as that. Going back to Mons Claudianus, you get passes, slips again on these little bits of pottery because it's more convenient. You give somebody this to hold, and it's the equivalent of a pass-through, one of those badges on a string that everybody seems to have these days, or, you know, even a ticket. So let pass Asclepiades, or often just numbered, 4 men and 20 donkeys, 1 woman and 2 children. You get these along the Myos Homos routes and the routes down to the Red Sea port as well. Passes to allow you to go through. So these are military zones, or at least zones under military control, where you need to show your documentation, basically. The documentation is fairly simple. It's scrawled on a broken bit of pottery, but again, it implies that there is someone official has issued this, and while obviously there are possibilities of forgery and the like, to go through the system, you're probably under control. And there are also, for people going along the Red Sea roads, there are tolls to pay with regulations on goods, on people, on animals, on all of these things. So ostraca, although at first they seem a very odd way of writing to us, you know, little broken bits of pottery, nevertheless they are clearly very practical things that do lots of day-to-day functions, but also some official and semi-official as well as private things. And the system seems to work. The impression is of order, of organisation, and there are huge quantities of these things. We have only a tiny fraction of what once existed, but because, again, pottery doesn't decay that easily, it just gets smashed in smaller bits. Quite a lot turns up in some of these sites. It's well preserved, and we get a sense of, again, the mundane aspect. You know, lots of people are using these written documents, and that's significant as well, but we'll come back to that. Now, obviously, we've got papyri as well. Here's a picture of one. I won't flash up lots of pictures of the individual ostraca, papyri, or writing tablets because, you know, they all basically look the same. Papyrus like this, it was nice to see in the British Museum Legion exhibition many of the ones, including a couple I'll refer to as we go on in this talk, that I've talked about, written about for many years. Nice to see the real thing, but you know, ultimately it's not that exciting unless you examine it very closely and start to read the letters, because it's like looking at any, you know, sheet you've just printed out from your printer with a letter on, with an email you've printed out, or something you've done, or notes or whatever. It's not exciting in itself. The contents can be, but the look of the thing. A writing tablet, here's one from Carlisle, just as a change from the normal Vindolanda ones, and we'll look at one from Carlisle later on. Again, they're not particularly exciting, just in their own right. So let's look at the background. In the main, the focus on this talk, as most of these talks about the Roman army, is going to be on the imperial army, 1st, 2nd, and to some extent 3rd century ADs, because that's when all the best archaeological, epigraphic, and subliterary information comes from. But what's happened before? What sense do we get of record keeping in the Roman army from earlier periods? So let's go back to the Republic, and one of the first, probably the first real mention is in Polybius, where he talks about, in the writing in the middle of the 2nd century BC, the duty of doing the rounds is entrusted to the cavalry. 4 men are chosen and informed by an optio, and these go to the tribune and get written orders from him stating what stations they are to visit and at what time. At a trumpet signal marking the first watch, the first of these men does the rounds of the sentries, visiting the posts mentioned in his orders. If he finds the guards of the first watch awake, he receives their tessera, that's the tablet. Again, a bit like an ostraca, but probably a bit more formal than that, but it's a bit of scroll thing where basically the password has been written. But if he finds anyone is asleep or has left his post, he calls those around him to witness the fact, proceeds on his rounds. Each of the men who's done the rounds brings back the tesserae, at daybreak to the tribune. If they deliver them all, they are suffered to depart without question. If one of them delivers fewer than the number of stations visited, they find out from examining the signs of the tesserae which station is missing. Sentries are summoned, investigations made over whether they were absent or whether men failed to complete their rounds. So, although there's an element where you think, you find that the sentry's asleep or gone, and you don't bother to do anything about it till morning, which you feel in a more dangerous situation is probably not a great idea. This presumably comes, Polybius has either been told or has perhaps read this in a sort of manual for army officers, perhaps tribunes, how you do things, how do you run the routine of night sentries and reporting on them. Interestingly enough, it requires it supervises both the men going round to check on the guards and also the guards themselves. Either can be held to blame. The guard could have been deserted his post or fallen asleep. The man going round to inspect, the cavalryman may not have bothered to go the whole way. So it's all regulated. There's also talk elsewhere of the record books and the nominal roll, this sort of thing. So the impression from Polybius is that even in the 2nd century BC, it's well established that the army uses a lot of, in inverted commas, paperwork. Things written down, records for long-term things, who you've got in your century, who you've got in your legion, what rank they hold, all this sort of thing, but also temporary things. This is just to manage how your century go, how it works in a camp. So for both the big things and the little things, writing and records are common and normal, and that rather implies they've been like that for some considerable time. Moving on to the 1st century BC, we have this slightly odd situation where Cicero arrives as proconsul of Cilicia in 51 BC, reluctantly having gone out to a province that he never really wanted to do. He talks about this. He writes back to Rome, says, "Since before my arrival, the army had been split up by some mutiny, and 5 cohorts had taken up a position outside Philomelius without a general, without a military tribune, general is legatus, without even a centurion, while the rest of the army was in Lycaonia. I ordered my legate, Marcus Annius, to take these 5 cohorts to the rest of the army." And later on, another letter to his friend Atticus hints the mutiny was over serious arrears in pay. So here you've got a situation where the governor arrives, and until he gets to the province, he doesn't know that there's part of his army, a quarter, perhaps even more, has split away and is camping, still in some sort of order and organisation, but without officers, basically gone on strike and moved themselves off to another location from the rest of the army. So it means that when he's back in Rome, he doesn't know this has happened. Now maybe it's happened during his journey out there, because obviously that takes a while to get from Italy to Asia Minor, sort of southern Turkey today. But also once he arrives in the province, people know what's happened. There are records that know, well, these units have gone off and done this. So even though this is a case where the army's broken down, there is the implication that you should know where everybody is, and they should be under control and under orders. So we get from earlier periods this sense that the Roman army is pretty bureaucratic from quite early on, and all this is well established. Now you could also see, and again this is something some scholars are rather reluctant to admit, but even though the Romans don't start writing history until after the Second Punic War, so beginning of the 2nd century BC, very end of the 3rd century BC, and then scholars will argue, well, there aren't really good records, and even the Romans didn't know what had happened in earlier centuries. There is clearly an awful lot of record keeping in some shape or form in terms of property, especially land ownership, but also liabilities for other things, and loans and debts and things like this. And this, you get this sense repeatedly in Cicero's legal speeches. He'll sort of mention a bit where now the evidence from the account books of this particular landowner or this particular merchant or whatever will be read into the, this is Exhibit A basically. And of course, Those were not published because that's not exciting. All the audience is supposed to want are the wonderful words of the orator himself. From a scholar's point of view, it'd be fascinating to have all that material, sort of mundane stuff of how property was managed. But most ancient states, and you could apply this to Greek cities as well, seem to be managing and understand who owns what and who is liable to do what thing from much earlier than perhaps we have evidence for clearly written laws and inscriptions. Because again, a lot of stuff written on perishable material isn't going to survive, and if it's so normal that nobody bothers to talk about it, then it doesn't get a mention in our sources. Same way a lot of this is the sort of thing that, on the whole, the historians, the Caesars, the Tacitus, people like this, they don't talk about this sort of stuff. Occasionally they'll give you a throwaway comment, but basically we know about this because of these survivals from the ostraca, the papyri, the writing tablets, that sort of thing. So let's go to a famous papyrus, which again they had in the British Museum exhibition, recording enlistment, because essentially the impression is that a written record follows every soldier throughout his entire career in the Roman army. So this is copy, Caius Minucius Italus to Celsianus. Give instructions, the 6 recruits approved by me for the cohort under your command be entered on the records with effect from 19th of February. I have appended their names and distinguishing marks to this letter. Caius Viturius Gemellus, age 21, no distinguishing marks. Gaius Longinus Priscus, age 22, scar on left eyebrow. Caius Julius Maximus, age 25, no distinguishing marks. Somebody, we've lost his praenomen. Julius Secundus, age 20, no distinguishing marks. Julius Saturninus, age 23, scar on left hand. Marcus Antonius Valens, age 22, scar on right side of forehead. Received 24th of February, AD 103, through Priscus Singularis, I, Avidius Arianus, Cornicularius of cohort 3, Itureorum, state that the original letter is in the records office of the cohort. So again, a copy is what survives of official documentation that's recorded. These people have already been recruited, they've been brought to this auxiliary cohort, and they've been entered on its book. So from then on, that's where they belong, that's where they're going to be recorded. A couple of interesting things. 3 of the men are called Julius, another Antonius. These are Roman names. You'd normally expect someone with that name to be a Roman citizen, and yet they've chosen to join an auxiliary unit. Again, something we can talk about another day, but just note it while we're here. Names like Longinus, Priscus, these are all very typical Roman soldier names. So both the money and the man is tracked from the very beginning of their time in the army. So let's look at this one. Longinus Longus, standard bearer of the first cohort of Lusitanians of the century of Tituleus, sends greetings to Longinus Tituleus, doctor, perhaps we're not quite sure about that reading, centurion. I have received from you 423 denarii, 20 obols, smaller coins to be retained on deposit for the recruits from Asia who have been distributed in the century to the number of 20 men. Year 21 of Trajan Optimus Caesar, our Lord, and then the monthly date, 3rd of September. It's one of 6 reports, one from the signifer of each of the cohort's 6 centuries, recording money bought by recruits, perhaps the remains of their travel money, their viaticum. This was the gold coins you were given on enlistment, and basically, but it, like the British Army in Wellington's era, you were given this bounty, and then they started to take money from it very quickly. Oh, we've got to pay for this, you've got to pay for that. But again, we've got here as a group thing. This particular document isn't listing their names, but that presumably there will be other documents that will have done that. 20 men have been added to this century. They've brought this money with them. So it's not just the men that are now the responsibility of the century and the cohort. So is the money they possess, and that will continue then with all their pay as time goes on. Another thing to note is animals as well as people are tracked in the same sort of level of detail. So Marius Maximus de Valentinus received 16th of March AD 208. Enter in the records according to the regular procedure a horse, 4 years old, reddish, masked, without brands, approved by me. Assign it to Julius Bassus, trooper of cohorts 20 Palmyranorum, under your command, 125 denarii, and make not in the with effect from May. There's the last bit of the reading isn't clear, as is often the case. It's fairly unusual for you to have the complete text with no bits where we can't quite read it, either because something's missing, or the ink has faded, or the scratches aren't clear on a writing tablet. Sometimes people just have bad handwriting. All of these things, and sometimes they don't spell things correctly, or there are peculiar local expressions that are harder for us to understand and read. But here again, you've got the same thing. In this case, a horse being assigned to a cavalryman, its value noted down. So quite who's liable? Is it the man or is it the unit? All of that is recorded and it's written down. And these are records that are, again, the implication, there are some Roman military records where you can see they've been annotated. So someone has pulled them out of an archive, changed things and put them back in. Every impression is that, contrary to the sort of the view of the primitive Roman Empire, these are not symbolic, these are very practical means of tracing individuals, animals and money, and also property stores, this sort of thing, weapons, equipment, very effectively. Now, like any modern bureaucracy, it's not going to be perfect, there will be mistakes, but nevertheless, it stands up pretty well. So all the way through your career, even till discharge. So here we've got copy of a release signed in year 12, Emperor Tiberius, Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, and the Egyptian month. Release from service by Gnaeus Virgilius Capito, prefect of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Tryphon, son of Dionysius, a weaver of the metropolis of Oxyrhynchus, suffering from cataract and impaired vision. The examination was conducted in Alexandria. So a man's enlisted in the army and then has been medically discharged as unfit. And you find others, there's somebody with, stomach injury, back injury, hernia, this sort of thing. Eyesight, in this case, has caused a problem. And there will, of course, be the accidents inevitably involved in training, particularly in the building that the Roman army does, and, of course, people who are wounded and honourably discharged because they're no longer fit for service. So, again, the army tracks you all the way through. And also, with auxiliary soldiers in particular, and legionaries have different things than with praetorians, because this changes your status. For an auxiliary, you become a Roman citizen, and you have the diplomas, the diplomata, the documents that record discharge of these men and this individual, and one wife and the children from that wife become Roman citizens because he's been honourably discharged. All of that record keeping is done, and bear in mind the role of Roman citizens is something maintained at Rome. So this is something where even an ordinary soldier's records from the auxilia ends up making a little impact on the larger archives in Rome itself. While you're in the service, obviously you're being paid. Considerable amounts of money are invested in the army. This is important to track, and also from the individual's point of view, the army keeps deducting things from you. You want to feel that they're only deducting what they should be deducting, and that nobody at any level is siphoning off your pay to line their own pockets. So we have a few detailed pay records. Most are fragmentary. There are a few that are detailed. So here we've got one. We'll go through this because it's just interesting. The consulship of Lucius Asinius, that's AD 81, Quintus Julius Proculus from Damascus, received the first salary instalment of the third year of the emperor, 247.5 drachma, out of which troops in Egypt were paid in Egyptian drachma, which is a different rate to the denarius. So there are some peculiarities with this. So hay, 10 drachma. For food, 80 drachma. Boots and straps, people have suggested maybe that straps mean socks. We're not quite sure. Maybe it's other leather work. 12 drachma. Saturnalia of the camps, you're contributing to a festival, but hopefully you get to join in. Something else cost you 60 drachma. Expenditure, balance deposited to his account, and had before, making a total of 201.5 drachma. Received the second instalment of the same year. At this stage, you're being paid 3 times a year, out of which hay, 10 drachmas, food, boots and straps again, to the standards, 4 drachma, expenditure, balance deposited to his account, had before, making a total of 343. Third instalment of the same year, 247, 5 drachma, out of which hay is 10 drachma, food 80 drachma, boots and straps, again, don't know that. For clothes, quite a big one this time, 145.5 drachma, so that's obviously a big, whether that's something that's been destroyed or whether every few years you're issued with new kit, but the army takes the money from you. Sort of like a student loan or something like that, I guess. Balance deposited his account, 343 drachma. So you have these detailed versions where we clearly see the bureaucratic system working, and this is how we're tracking a soldier, his pay, his equipment, how much he's got left over, how much he's had to pay the army, if he's got a horse, what the horse is, how that's distinguished, and when they no longer are in service, when they're discharged, all of this is followed. So occasionally we get the detail, we see the system actually working quite clearly. Often we see the shadow of it. Now, this is something I've talked about with the promotion, commissioning and transfer of centurions. There's a video some while back about 2 centurions, and we'll look at a couple of these blokes now. Just because the only way this system could work is if there is a bureaucracy managing it, and this is important enough, and we'll see why it's clear that that's how it was done because of the importance of these things as we go on. So let's just look at, this is an inscription from Rome of a chap called Tiberius Claudius Vitalis, son of Tiberius, the tribe Galeria. From the rank of Roman eques, he received the post of centurion in Legio V Macedonica. Now this man is an equestrian, so he could have gone off and had a career as a prefect of auxiliary units, tribune in the legions, then prefect of cavalry, but doesn't. Instead, he chooses to be a legionary centurion. There are a significant number of men recorded as doing this. In fact, there are just as many men recorded as directly commissioned from the equestrian order as there are commissioned from the ranks. Most centurions don't tell us what they did before they were centurion, or if they did anything in the army before they were centurion. Anyway, he's advanced from Legio V Macedonica to Legio I Italica, decorating the Dacian war with necklaces, armbands, ornaments, and rampart crown. Advanced from Legio I Italica to I Minervia, again decorating the Dacian war with necklaces, armbands, ornaments, and a rampart crown. Advanced from I Minervia to 20th Victrix. Was also advanced within the same legion, and advanced, so at each stage he's getting promotions in grade within the centurionate that he doesn't specify. From 20th to 9th Hispana, advanced from 9th Hispana to 7th Claudia, loyal and faithful, also advanced within the same legion, served in the second cohort as Princeps Posterior, so that's not the Princeps Prior, so it's about sort of middle ranking. For 11 years, lived 41 years. So he's made steps from sort of junior centurion. He's never quite got to the top. He hasn't been a primary pilaris. He hasn't got to the first cohort. He doesn't seem to be the pilus prior, the man in charge, at least the most senior centurion of a cohort. Whether he's the man in charge or not, that's a talk for another day. 6 legions, internal steps in promotion in 2 of them, as well as decorations that give you status and various things. So there's often a bounty with some of these. This is clearly evidence for someone tracking all of this. This isn't just up to the individual legions, because how do legions in different provinces decide this? This is even more marked with Petronius Fortunatus, who is one of the men we dealt with in the talk on the 2 centurions. So if you want more detail on him, go back and have a look at that. Who served for 50 years, 4 in First Italica as clerk, officer in charge of the watchword Tesserarius, orderly Optio, standard bearer Signifer, promoted to centurion by the vote of the same legion. So this is a man who served for 4 years in the ranks, though again he's been a sort of warrant officer NCO equivalent, if we can use those, very quickly. So he hasn't actually spent a lot of time. He's cornicularius. He's had 4 years to go through 4 posts, so he hasn't spent a lot of time in any of these. And the idea that he probably hasn't been an ordinary private being yelled at and made to do things for very long at all. And then he's commissioned as centurion, but he hasn't come directly in as centurion. So that's significant. Again, we'll come back. Centurions are fascinating and often misunderstood. We'll talk more about them in other videos in the future. And then he goes through First Italica, 6th Ferrata, 1st Minervia, 10th Gemina, 2nd Augusta, 3rd Augusta, 3rd Gallica, 30th Ulpia, 6th Victrix, 3rd Cyrenaica, 15th Apollinaris, 2nd Parthica, 1st Adjutrix, and gets various awards. And his son, who only serves in 2 legions by comparison, but serves for 6 years, 22nd Primigenia and then 2nd Augusta. It's early 3rd century, because his 2nd Parthica is formed by Septimius Severus, end of the 2nd century AD. So this is the date of all that. Just go through, if we look at this, simplifying it. So he's in 1st Italica, which is on the Danube, Lower Moesia, 6th Ferrata in Syria, 1st Minervia, Lower Germany, 10th Gemina, Upper Pannonia, 2nd Augusta, Britain, 3rd Augusta, Numidia, 3rd Gallica, Syria again, 30th Ulpia, Lower Germany again, 6th Victrix, Britain again, 3rd Cyrenaica in Arabia, 15th Apollinaris, Cappadocia, northern Turkey, 2nd Parthica, probably in Italy. It's normally stationed Alba Iulia near Rome, 1st Adjutrix, one of the Pannonias, so on the Danube. Now, again, go back to the other video, because obviously there's a question mark. Does he actually physically go to all of these units, or does he get a step in promotion, but he's actually on detached service doing something somewhere else? But nevertheless, basically his career has taken him to legions stationed all around the empire, provinces as varied as Arabia and Britain. And the records have to be kept. There is not a shred of evidence for any legion having more than its standard complement of centurions, which is probably 59 or 60, depending on how you read aspects of the evidence and the organisation. You can't be a centurion without actually there being a post in a legion for you to occupy, even if you physically are not there and you're on detached service all the time. So that has to be recorded. This required someone to work out where this man is going all over the empire. Now, as a reminder of the importance of centurions, let's look at the trial of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso in AD 19, where he'd been governor of Syria. He'd had a spat with Germanicus, the emperor's adopted son, actual nephew. He'd been expelled from his province by Germanicus. Germanicus then died under suspicious circumstances. We can do the Claudius stuff another day. Piso then returned to Syria by bounties and bribery, by attentions to the humblest private, by dismissals of the veteran centurions and stricter tribunes, whom he replaced by dependents of his own or by men of the worst character, by permitting indolence in the camp, license in the towns, in the country a vagrant and riotous soldiery. He carried corruption to such a pitch that in the language of the rabble he was known as father of the legions, parens legionum. That's Tacitus, the historian's account, writing nearly a century later. But we also have the Senatus Consultum, the official decree after his trial, which he committed suicide before he could actually be punished, where he talks about him going back and basically starting civil war. Because that's what you start to do. If you are too flattering, too generous to the soldiers, then it's assumed you have an ulterior motive. And bear in mind, particularly in AD 19, civil war is not too distant a memory. So he tries to regain a province after Germanicus has died. Roman soldiers were forced into conflict with another when he had also manifested his unparalleled cruelty by inflicting the death penalty on many without hearing their cases, without consulting his consilium, that's his sort of staff, his senior officers, his council, by crucifying not only foreigners but also a centurion, a Roman citizen. He had destroyed the military discipline established by the divine Augustus and maintained by Tiberius Caesar Augustus, not only by allowing soldiers not to obey in the traditional manner those in command of them, but also by giving donatives in his own name from the fiscus of our princeps, a deed which he was pleased to see led to some soldiers being called Pisonians and others Caesarians, and by going on to confer distinctions on those who, after usurping such a name, had shown him obedience. So again, it confirms the Tacitian account in more detail. He's executed a centurion, not just done that, but crucified the man. I mean, that really is breaking so many laws, so many Roman taboos as to how citizens and men of rank should be treated. He's been promoting his own men. So again, it's this danger. An emperor simply cannot afford to let individual governors start promoting their own men as centurions, bumping them up, favouring them, persuading the soldiers with donatives in their own name, winning the soldiers over to personal loyalty to the governor rather than to the emperor. All pay, all promotions, all decorations come from the emperor. Minor exception of the governor of North Africa at the beginning of the 1st century AD, but that soon changes, where he's still a senatorial proconsul. But everybody else, everything else comes in the same way that you would have, well, until recently, the Queen's Commission in the British Army, now the King's Commission. It's one of those things, it's having had a queen all my lifetime as British, it takes a while. I have to stop and think to sing God Save the King rather than Queen, and to talk about the king rather than the queen. But again, the same idea is that you are not, in the pay, in the service of your particular local commander. Ultimately, you are the monarch who is the head of state, and are appointed and elected politicians and all this sort of thing. I can't remember the details of the oath from all those years ago I took it. When somebody usurps that, so in a Roman context, far more than in a modern British one, the threat of civil war is very real. And it is why the emperor is ultimately a military dictator. His power rests on the fact that he has a monopoly on military force. So you simply cannot allow other people, your governors, to come along and subvert that system. Therefore, there is, again, apart from the fact you see these centurions dotted around, there are good reasons why the Roman emperor would make sure that centurions and their whole careers are under his control, just as equestrian officers, prefects, tribunes, all of this sort of thing, and the control of senatorial posting. So even though there are, 1,800 legionary centurions, double that and add a bit for the auxiliaries, for the praetorians, for all the others, You are controlling the careers of thousands of people, but it is important that you do so because it is too dangerous otherwise. But it also is abundantly clear from the way people can be posted from one end of the empire to the other, whether or not they physically go there, is that this is all recorded at every stage and with great care. Because again, these ranks will give you status, rights, pay. If you're a prime pilaris in the legions and you complete your year, you end up getting equestrian status. That's a big step. And again, you have to remember all the roots of this come from a society that has emphasized citizenship and being a Roman citizen as a very big deal and something that needs to be recorded and updated every few years with the census and all of these things. So let's move on and go back to a different type of record keeping, which is less about the individual, more about the unit, because we have a few strength reports and returns that survive on papyrus and some fragments of others on writing tablets. So let's look at this one that probably dates around about the time of the Emperor Trajan. Strength report Pridianum of cohors 1 Hispanorum Veterana Quingenaria, commanded by first name Los Aruntianus, prefect. Total of soldiers on 31st of December, 546. This is a cohors equitatis, so it should have 480 infantrymen, 120 cavalrymen, so it should be 600 plus officers and bits and bobs, cooks and bottle washers. It's got 546, so it's not at full strength, and all the reports we have, units don't tend to be at their paper strength, just like the units in modern and other reasonably well recorded eras from the last few centuries. Including 6 centurions, 4 decurions, 119 cavalry, so you've nearly got the full 120 you're supposed to have, also including lost number of duplicari, 3 sesquiplicari, 1 infantry duplicarius, and infantry sesquiplicarius. Accessions after 1st of January from Faustinus the Legate, 2 men. Have they been detached with his bodyguard, with his staff, on some other duty? Don't know. Stragglers, 30. Total accessions, there's a gap for 30 and stragglers, the lost number is lost. 50 people have come back, so units gone up to 596 men. So that's very, very close to what you should have, including 6 centurions, 4 decurions, and blah, blah, blah. So we've got the number for duplicari now, but we've lost other bits and pieces. From these are lost, posted to the fleet by order of Faustinus the Legate, so he's clearly the legatus Augusti, the man in charge of the province in which this unit is stationed. By order of Justus the Legate, including 1 cavalryman. So somebody else, either the legate has changed, or this is a legionary legate, or from someone else, sent back to Herennius Saturninus. Transferred to army of Pannonia, again with the numbers are lost, it's 1 or more because we can see the first digit, not that. Drowned. So somebody has died in an accident. Killed by robbers, Latrones, 1 cavalryman. Killed, the number is lost. So there have been casualties, there has been fighting, though again it might be fighting against simple criminals, or it might be Latrones, as if you go back to the talk I did on raiding and that low-level warfare. These can be barbarian raiders and others can be described as bandits, Latrones as well, in the same way that, depending on your point of view, you can describe your enemy as terrorists and this sort of thing. It's partly a reflection of reality, but it's also partly how you want reality to be seen. So total lost, again, not there. Returned with the stragglers, 1. Net, again, the number lost. 4 centurions, 6 centurions, 4 decurions, 110 plus cavalry, we're not quite sure how many, including 2 duplicari, blah, 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 6 infantry sesquiplicari. From these are absent, so that's the number you have on your books, which is quite close to the number you should have. However, absent in Gaul to get clothing, so you're not in the province of Gaul, these have been sent elsewhere to bring clothing, presumably uniform placements, to get grain, gone somewhere. Across the river somewhere, we're not quite sure which one it is, whether we've got the full name, to get horses, among them so many cavalrymen. At Castra in Garrison, among them 2 cavalrymen. In Dardania at the mines, again numbers lost. Total absent outside the province, including blank number of cavalrymen. Inside the province, again, most of the numbers are lost, but we get what they're doing.
Orderlies of Fabius Justus the legate, among them Carus decurion. So you've lost an officer and some men. In the office of Latinianus, procurator of the emperor. So again, the financial official within the province. At Pyroboridava in Garrison, at Buridava in Garrison. Across the Danube on an expedition, including sesquiplicari, 23 cavalry, 2 infantry sesquiplicari. Likewise across to defend the grain supply. Likewise scouting with centurion, name partly lost, including 70 cavalrymen. At the grain ships, including 1 centurion. Headquarters with the clerks. To the Hymus Mountains to bring cattle. On guard over draft animals, including sesquiplicari. Likewise on guard over. Total absent in both categories, including 1 centurion, 3 decurions, so many cavalry, 2 infantry sesquiplicari. So you've lost a significant number of men in terms of they're off on detached duty. So they're not with the parent unit if it's called upon to fight or do anything. It has these detachments off, including 3 out of your 4 decurions and 1 centurion. So you've lost a significant proportion of your officers, probably quite a significant proportion of your cavalry as well, because several of these categories mention that there are horsemen there. And again, cavalry are very useful for these escort jobs and patrolling jobs and to be sent here, there and everywhere. But again, notice in this no hint of an entire century being detached to do something, or a contubernium, or so many contubernia being sent as those groups. Everybody is allocated as individuals to these tasks. The groups are useful for when the unit is in one place and is doing things. Let's look at another one. This one of a mixed cohort, possibly first Lusitanorum, so originally Portuguese, from Egypt in early 3rd century, 213 to 16. Have been added to the strength, promoted from cohorts 1 Apaminorum. I'm getting into these tongue twister things every now and again. Antoniniana. I remember reading out a student essay when I was back at Oxford all those years ago and getting really caught in the groove of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus Alabrogicus. And it was just, I broke down completely. Anyway, so 1 centurion has come to join the unit. Sent by the prefect, Aurelius Septimius Heraclitus, prefect of Egypt. From the soldiers of Legio II Triana, Antoniana Fortis, another centurion sent by the prefect. From the soldiers, a soldier has been sent by the prefect. Transferred from another auxiliary cohort, 2 soldiers. From the same cohort, from the numerous. Again, people have been added to the unit. However, you've also lost people posted to the fleet. Soldier invalided out. A soldier killed 7 soldiers, among them a cavalryman, camel rider. This is one of these records of the dromedari. These they're not whole units, but there are men attached to cohorts equitata that are camel riders. Obviously, they tend to occur in units that are stationed in areas where this is useful. Total of those who've permanently left the strength, 30. So they've lost 30 people, among them 2 centurions, 11 cavalrymen and a cavalry rider. Remainder net number, soldiers 457, among them 6 centurions, 4 decurions, 100 cavalrymen, 13 camel riders. So again, you're getting close to this. Should be about 120 horsemen. You're down by 20. Camel riders, we don't know how many you're supposed to have. That's close to the cavalry certainly you're supposed to have, which means the infantry in this unit are significantly under strength. Those still at 3/4 or so, 80%ish. So it's not reduced to being useless as a unit. It's just you don't have as many of them as you should. One thing always to remember: cavalrymen get better pay in the cohorts equitata, so it's easier in a sense. There's more incentive for people to want to do that and keep the numbers up there. Right. And temporarily absent from the cohort in the Cora, that's in the rural district. Soldiers 126, so you should have 457, but actually you've got not much over 300 actually with the unit, and there are centurions and decurions with them. Likewise, they're detached to emoluments with NCOs, Coptos for money, escort somebody with the service, 5 cavalrymen, sent to Coptos with letters, Kaini to get hides, office of the Epistragus of the Thebiad, detained by the prefect of an ala of cavalry, so somebody's over there who's an acting epistrategus. These are regional officials. It's where the army comes over and takes a measure of civilian administration, because in the end this is a military province. Nicu to carry letters, relieved and not yet returned from the lower country, so people who've been detached but they haven't yet come back. So again, what you get is very detailed accounting of where your men are, so that somebody can look at this, note it down. Now, there'll be other records where these men will be named, so that you can, for instance, as we saw with the ostraca from Egypt earlier on, you can call for this particular cavalryman from the curator of this garrison because you know he's there. And there are some documents that record that sort of thing that we haven't got time to look at in detail. We might glance at a few as we go on. I can't remember what I've got in my my next few slides. But you get these detailed reports where the commander of a unit can look and say, I want to know how many men are on the strength at the moment, and the figures are there. And also that means that these reports appear to be sent in, so that how often we don't know, but the provincial governor can know, okay, I've got so many cohorts, but what's their actual strength? So is there anybody who's really been run down to a very low level and therefore I can't expect to perform certain tasks, or that they need a recruiting party sent out, or they need people drafted in, whatever it might be. So that is all there, and this is an ongoing process. This is just the army's routine. Every day you do some checks, but more at regular intervals you go through more detailed analysis of who's where, who's in this unit, where they are and what they're doing, who's been lost, who's been gained. You can get these daily reports from Dura Europus, this 3rd century site down in the Euphrates that's destroyed by the Sasanian Persians, and therefore it's very well preserved. So here we've got of a miliary Cohors Equitata, the 20th Palmyrinorum. So 27th of March, net total of rank and file soldiers 923, among these 9 centurions, 8 men on double pay, 1 on pay and a half, camel riders 34, so it's another desert unit with this element, among these 1 man on pay and a half, cavalry 223, among these 5 decurions, 7 men on double pay, 4 on pay, and half of the 20th cohort pay and a half, the 20th cohort of Palmyrini, Severiana, Alexandriana, Julius Rufianus, tribune, sent the password chosen from the 7 planets, Holy Mercury. So this is basically order of the day, day's report, who have we got, who's in the unit, this is our strength, this is the password for today, all officially done. And there are enough of these, this is clearly something that is done absolutely every day by a garrison. And then it starts to go into detail. Sent 5 soldiers, among them 70 camel riders, 1 cavalryman from the century of Marianus, Aurelius Licinius, century of Pudens, Aurelius Demetrius, century of Nigrinus, Aurelius Romanus, Aurelius Rufus, troop of Antoninus. So again, you're starting, in some cases you are detailing people by name. Sometimes it's by group, sometimes it's by name, even in these official reports. Returned, formally detailed, so it goes through. Timinius Paulinus Decurion announced the orders of the day. We shall do whatever may be ordered. We shall be ready for every command. For those of you who've ever read Harry Sidebottom's 3rd century AD novels, he uses this formula from these Dura strength reports. That's basically whenever a Roman soldier of any rank responds, that he recites this little mantra, and it gives it a very sort of totalitarian feel to it. And it might be right, but this is where it comes from. It's certainly the formal sort of statement at the start of the day that this unit is doing what it should be doing. There are similar ones from Vindelander that reports everybody's at station, so is the baggage, by the optiones and curatores of a unit. So the second in command of the century and the Toma. Again, it's every day. Those standing guard at the standards of our lords, Alexander Augustus, Decurion, Timinius Paulinus, shrine keeper Aurelius Silvanus. So in the headquarters building you've got the shrine of the standards, and it's detailed as to who's there and who's responsible. It's a bit like being sort of officer of the day, these sorts of things. Supervisor, inspector of sentry. So again, it's all detailed, and again, this is some of these things where you see it as, it does seem very modern. The way of expression might be a little bit different, but the nature of routine would be familiar to many soldiers of many armies. 29th of March, net total of rank and file soldiers 914 probably. Julius Rufianus the tribune sent to obtain barley, soldiers among these. Magnoma sent his escorts to the barley collectors, returned those formerly detailed to Adartha, 2 soldiers, Centurion Negrinus, returned those formerly detailed to headquarters of the governor with letters, returned those formerly detailed with men present at the headquarters of the governor from the 2nd Part-Mounted cohort, sent to collect wood for the bath, 1 soldier of the Centurion Negrinus, Zebidas son of Arneus. So you get this group sense. This is what the unit is, and basically the main things that stand out that you can very quickly get from these: this is our strength, these are how many have been detached, these are how many we've actually got in service. And there's the strength report from Vindlander that talks about men in the hospital. So, you know, yes, we've got them at the base, but these aren't actually fit for active duty at the moment. We sometimes get these glimpses of the records of an individual. So here we've got some from Egypt from the 80s AD. Marcus Papyrus Rufus departed from camp to the granary at Neapolis in accordance with the letter of Titus Suedus Clemens, prefect of the camp in the 3rd year of Emperor, probably Titus. He returned on 21st of January of the same year, departed to the granary in the Mercurium in the 1st year of the Emperor Domitian. He returned in the same year on 13th of July. He departed on guard duty in the 4th year of Domitian, 1st of April, returned the same year, departed the granary at Mercurium. So he's doing these repeated things. He's being sent, and he's clearly involved in grain supply, or at least escorting and supervising this. And here you are, but you've got an ordinary soldier, and you are tracing exactly where he is and where he's been. And that can be checked. Another one, Titus Flavius Saturninus, departed for the purpose of dredging harbours, 14th January, returned in the same year, departed with Timinius Centurion, returned in the same year, departed with Maximus the freedman, probably somebody from the procurator's staff, unless he's a freedman of one of the senior officers. So you have, again, this detail as to what individuals are doing. And while there are gaps, while we only get a small proportion of what once existed, it is clearly part of a much bigger system and a sense of a highly organised, perhaps at times slow and cumbersome bureaucracy, but it's there. Everybody and everything is tracked. This next slide might be a bit harder to see on the screen, especially if you're on a small screen, but I don't quite know how to break it up otherwise. Again, the details don't need to detain us too much. This is the famous duty roster for a century of Legio III Cyrenaica in Egypt, late 1st century AD. And it's at less than half strength, but it records by the man's name. So, for instance, and then it goes on the different days, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, to the 10th of October, what fatigues they should be doing. This isn't the full duty roster of what they're doing for the entire day, although in some cases some of the tasks may require that. It's basically, if you'd be a notice board in a modern barracks room, there'd be other things as well. This is not the be-all and end-all, but this is the one of the bits you have to read, say, okay, what am I doing today? So, for instance, Gaius Julius Valens, he's on the 1st, he's in the arena, perhaps training. Arena is, obviously comes from sand originally, but the amphitheatre, but maybe he's there. Could be on guard, but he could just be there because they're using it as a training facility. 2nd, he seems to be in a tower. On the 3rd, something to do with drainage. The 4th, boots, so is that cleaning equipment, cleaning his own in the barrack room. On the 5th, he's in the armoury. Nothing recorded for the 6th. On the 7th, he's at the baths. On the 8th, he's orderly. On the 9th, he's in the century, so again, presumably tasks that are required by that century. And on the 10th, he's in the baths. We get others. There's somebody on detachment, somebody who's doing duty in another century, somebody detached to the granaries at Neapolis, somebody probably cleaning the latrines, gate guard, that crops up quite a bit. Other people, you do get duties in centuries of other centurions. So again, all of that's quite interesting, but it's part of the thing. So we've looked at people a lot, and let's look at equipment. And this is one of the Carlisle tablets. We showed a picture of one early on. Late 1st century AD, so Carlisle is to the west of what will become Hadrian's Wall, but this predates the wall itself. May date to the time of the famous governor Julius Agricola. And it's from an inspection of a cavalry unit, an ala of cavalry. And it's Docilis to Algorinus, his prefect, greetings. As you ordered, we've attached below all the names of lancers, troopers, cavalrymen who are missing lances, either those who did not have fighting lances or did not have the smaller subarmales. There's arguments as to whether a subarmales is a type of lance, which is how this text was interpreted, or whether it's a garment you wear underneath your armour, a sort of padded jerkin. Because that's usage crops up later on, or who did not have regulation swords. Troop of Genialis Senior, Veracundus, 1 fighting lance, 2 subarmales. Troop of Albinus, whole page lost. Troop of, another name, Docca, 2 subarmales. Troop of Docilis, Pastor, 2 subarmales. Felicio, 1 fighting lance. Troop of Solemnis, fighting lance, 2 subarmales. Troop of Mansuetius, 1 fighting lance. Victorinus, son of is a fighting lance. Troop of Martialis, 1 fighting lance. Troop of Genialis. Festus, missing 2 subarmales. Maior, 2 subarmales. Somebody fighting lance. Troop of Victor, missing something. May you fare well, Algorinus, with your family, my lord. So this is where suggests it's a fairly routine thing, but there's been a specific go and inspect the weaponry of this of each troop and see who's missing things, who hasn't got what they should have. And there's a relatively small number of people per unit are missing stuff, but nevertheless they've got it. Now either it's worn out, it's no longer fit for service, or they've lost it, or they flogged it, or who knows. But it is not treated as a major offence, it's treated as a sort of routine thing. This is an inspection. And obviously from the point of view of the unit and its efficiency, everybody ought to have all this kit. This is one of the few cases where we get specific inspection of particular bits of equipment. In this case, mostly these lanciae, these lance cum javelin. It's a one-handed thing. It's sort of a lot of these terms, as with gladius, but lancia and hasta and things like that, they are used in ways that defy modern attempts to make them specific as to this particular type. And there may well have been different usage. That's why one of the problems with the subarmales is it's something that this unit is using to describe perhaps a smaller javelin. Josephus talks about cavalrymen having this sort of quiver of lighter, shorter throwing javelins as well as the main throw or thrust lance. But we don't really know. But anyway, that gives us a detail of another routine thing, people looking at equipment. Finally, let's come to, again, coming back to individual soldiers, and in this case, material and reporting. So again, we've moved on from equipment, but let's go. We've talked about people being sent to granaries, do all this sort of thing. Let's look at a bit more detail about how the army is getting its supplies. So this is 3rd century from North Africa on ostraca again, these fragments of pottery. 259. To Octavius Festus Decurion, my commanding officer, Aemilius Aemilianus, soldier, sends greetings. I have sent you, Lord, by the camel drivers of Idibal, 7.5 celusa of wheat, which is equivalent to 90 nonagetina modi, the consul in office after the consulship of Tuscus and Bassus, 21st January. And again, Festus, to Octavius Festus Decurion, my commanding officer, Aemilius Aemilianus, soldier, sends greetings. I have sent you, Lord, by the camel driver, Isuthcan, 7 or 9 of wheat, equivalent to the Roman measurement of modi, 108, consul in office, Tuscus and Bassus, Octavius Festus Decurion, my commanding officer, Aemilius Aemilianus, soldier, sends greetings. I have sent you, Lord, by the camel driver, 20 this time, equivalent to 60 modi, consuls in office, Octavius Festus Decurion, my commanding officer, Aemilius Aemilianus, sends greetings. I have sent you, Lord, by Macagus, 2 Sidipia of wheat, equivalent to 24 modi. So there are different means of calculation, different measures being used, and slightly different. So it's slightly confusing, but again, it's very formal. The same man is sending to his decurion, his commanding officer, that I've basically approved. There's this amount of wheat coming to you by this named camel driver. So, if he doesn't deliver it, then he's responsible for that. So this is where the army, and there are others where one of the other Carlisle tablets has the amount of wheat and barley supplied to probably the same cavalry ala and individual troops and how much they're consuming and all this sort of thing. So we get a sense of the army measuring and tracing and sort of following through things as well as people. And that's consumable things like food, equipment that will last for a while but not forever. We only get glimpses. We don't get all the detail of everything they do. and we're left to guess. But I would hope at the end of this you will see that there's a very clear pattern, that this is a highly organised and on the whole efficient bureaucratic structure, military machine, for want of a better term. That the army knows where its people are, it knows what they're doing, at least what they should be doing. It knows who it's got, it knows when they're discharged for various reasons, it knows how to feed them, it knows how to supply them, it knows how to give them orders. There are instructions, there's an implication. All of this comes across as very much routine, not as exceptional things. Even to the, yes, it's the way it's expressed. This chap keeps on greeting his decurion commanding officer, but it's a little bit like, the formalities, the old one, Mr. So-and-so's compliments, and would you do X, Y, and Z? It's the way the Roman army and Roman society work, but it's not so very different. These are cases where many aspects of this would be fairly familiar to anybody who's gone through a military system. It's not that different from a lot of civil service bureaucracies and other organisations these days, because ultimately the intention is a practical one. And it might be that bureaucracy takes over, as it so often does. It might well be that there are mistakes, there are confusions. I always think my late father used to tell a story of how he was posted from his infantry unit, where he was completing his training, to a supposedly all volunteers airborne unit of the Ordnance Corps, of all things, and was torn off a strip by his commanding officer for having pulled strings and gone over his head when he hadn't done anything. And presumably there was somewhere else another Private Goldsworthy who'd been desperate to get to this special unit, and instead, somehow or other, they picked on my father instead and posted him, and that was how the rest of his army career played out. I remember hearing a story from National Service days, post-Second World War, where somebody was rushed by, I think it was the Army rather than the Navy, flown out by as quick a route as possible to Singapore in the 1950s, and when he reached there, nobody knew why he'd been sent or what the purpose was or anything about him, and it was about 6 months before he finally got posted back to Britain, where again these errors will occur. So I'm not trying to pretend that the Romans were somehow perfect, that everything they did went through immaculately and there was never any confusion. These are human beings, they're going to make mistakes, there are going to be people who are bad at their job, there are going to be elements of corruption, the probability that at times some people were trying to claim pay for soldiers that didn't exist, that's, might well be there, because these sorts of abuses, or for equipment and material that hasn't existed or has been lost, and the way that units will acquire things that they're not necessarily supposed to have, but they're not willing to give them up, or that happens accidentally. Again, I remember another distinguished archaeologist telling me that his father at the end of the Second World War was on an RAF base in the north of England, and when they were decommissioning things, and they suddenly had to work out, well, this is the official list of what we should have in terms of even things like furniture, and anything that they weren't supposed to have, they decided it was easier to burn and destroy than try to explain how they got it, because nobody knew. Lots of people had passed through this over the years of the war in particular. The only problem was at the back of the hangar they discovered an entire Wellington bomber, and they decided they couldn't really burn this, and they had to admit that this existed. But nobody knew how it had got there and how long it had been there. It had simply been, it was behind lots of stacked stores that were not required. So I would expect the Roman army to have all these oddities, these bits of confusion, because they're human. But overwhelmingly, this is one of those aspects, and the Roman army does generally. It isn't identical to a modern 20th, 21st century military force, and obviously the nature of communications and the speed of communications is fundamentally different. But it does show enough kinship to that there is a high level of organisation. The army does seem to know where people are, what they're doing, what they're entitled to, where the equipment is, where their horses are, the mules are, all of these sorts of things. It isn't perfect, but it is remarkably efficient, which of course explains why the Roman army is able to operate over such a wide area and do so for such a long time, and appear on the whole to get people in the right place at the right time. So that's really the background to when we come on to strategy in a few months' time, probably. But also other aspects. We'll look at outposting, where people are, what they're doing, how long they're stationed in these touches. What these little outposts, whether it's on Hadrian's Wall in a Mile Castle, whether it's some fort at somewhere, whether it's out on the roads to the Red Sea, what they were doing, what they were for, what this meant for the functioning, the purpose, the tactical use of the Roman army. Because if you've got all these soldiers on detached service, what are the parent units doing, and how ready for immediate combat are they? Which of course comes into aspects we've talked about already with raiding, which also ties into this whole strategy question. So we will look at all these things in due course. This one, I hope people will have the patience, because as I say, it's not as dramatic or as action-packed as when we're talking about tactics or strategy or actual fighting and warfare. But it's very important for understanding how the army worked and what we should expect. When we come to these gaps in the evidence and we don't quite know why the Romans are doing something, if we can trace and understand what they're doing, and we have an idea of how the whole system works, we're in a better position to conjecture and make it clear that, well, these are the possibilities. These are the sort of things we think they might be doing. This might explain this end result. So there we go. I hope it's been of some interest. It certainly it gives us a sort of worm's eye view of the Roman army, and makes everything very human, very immediate. So that's it for today. Not quite sure what's coming next time. We might be doing another one of the HBO Romes, or we might be back to Conquered and the Proud, where we'll be starting to look at the first triumvirate. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching.